Well, thank you so much. I'm here with my role of researcher. I work in the marketing and media management department, so I'm involved in media business, media management, and media funding. So there was this worry before about the funding of media and the crisis of the business model, and we are absolutely aware of that, definitely, and that's why this is one of the war packages. So look at these ecosystems that is a structure around companies, media companies, that most of them have been very big media companies, very successful during many years, and nowadays most of them are in an economic crisis. And so that's why we asked our interviews about the funding of their own companies, the traditional ones and the alternative ones. And also we interviewed managers. You have here 13 managers, media managers on Austria and Spain. And we were talking with them about the business model, the new solutions, and the current economic crisis that media companies are facing. So in the interviews, as we said before, in the 8 countries, we introduced some questions about funding. And this is what we are going to share with you and our conclusions after studying all these media companies and talking to journalists and the media managers. So we ask about revenue models, market restructuring, platform, power, and independence pressures. So in this sense, I think we have a very complete picture of what is going on.
Yes, thanks, Mercedes. So there will be some overlap between what we are showing here today and what I talked here yesterday for the people who were here. So be patient. But there are also new things. And there is also, I'd like only to highlight that the same sample of interviews with traditional journalists and alternative content creators to which the previous work package referred to is also used in this analysis. This especially for the people who are not involved in the project to understand methodologically how we organize this. And in addition, on top of this, the interviews with the managers that Mercedes mentioned. And in all cases, there were questions regarding revenue, funding, and to what extent this has an impact on their own daily routines as journalists, as content producers. We struggled a lot to go through all the interviews and understand which patterns we find there, but we have come up with something. The first something that I want to show this morning here is what we see in this sample as the existing revenue models. Basically, we clustered the existing revenue models across all of these journalists, content producers in these 6 groups. First group, the most basic traditional one here in Europe, the group which is publicly funded. These are organizations which are funded with levies, fees, or general budget from the state. In some cases, with some level of advertising, which can be smaller, bigger, but plays a minor role, even if sizable in some contexts. This is mainly directed to the public service media, the public service broadcasters especially, which in some countries have been extended into public service media to operate with a remit which is more broad, towards online, for example. Although in some specific cases, such as Austria, this funding also serves to fund community media. There is a very well structure of community media in Austria, whose main funding stream, revenue stream, is public money from these fees, for example. Um, and this leads to an ecosystem of flourishing ecosystem of community media, which have resources and do quite interesting work, actually, with communities that usually don't find their way in the coverage of traditional journalism. What have been the issues here so far is that this group is facing the no inflation adjustment problem. So governments are saying we are not cutting the budget in most cases. In some cases they are, but in most cases they are not cutting the budget. They are not readjusting, and inflation has become an issue in Europe in the last 5-6 years, especially. So in practice, the funds are reducing. So the cost of paying salaries is increasing. The cost of doing investigative work are increasing. Running infrastructure, operation, energy. So we have managers mentioning this in the interviews, and despite that, the budget remains nominally the same. And of course, these outlets face political pressure, which is not something exactly new, actually. Public service media have always been in this tension position. But of course, when you have more budget squeeze, these political pressures become more salient. And we see this happening, and we see journalists working in public service media expressing this. We also see, in the case of Austria, community media expressing these concerns and seeing themselves targeted, capture, literally, the government trying even to steer coverage from community media, which reach a very marginal public, but still. And this is a revenue model that goes across all countries, nearly. Second big revenue model is the commercial one, how we call it, which is the legacy of commercial media as we know them. Currently, the revenue model of this group is consisted of mainly of subscriptions or some variations of subscriptions like memberships, these kind of things. Ads, advertising is still a very important source, but declining. And in some cases, subsidies. Subsidies that we see in this group here, they vary between 5 and 10%. I think in our sample, we didn't find any commercial outlet in this category that has more than 10% of subsidies, public funds sustaining their model. But it is already an important component of how the budget of these outlets is arranged. These are then professional or traditional, as our colleagues from Germany prefer to call them. They are mostly commercially driven, although there are some non-profit there. They are the legacy media, commercial media that we know. And what we find quite striking is that there is growing awareness in this group regarding the platform traffic trap, as we call it here. I mean, the heyday of platform as this traffic driver to outlets, this is gone. This is in the past. No one believes in this anymore in the media. So now we are in this inflection point where journalists and managers, they are figuring out where do we go to from now. So that's that history that we have believed in, that platforms will increase our traffic, that platforms themselves have told, okay, this has been very marginal. And they say, now with AI, this will become even more illusionary, so to say. So we have to find a way of dealing with platforms. They exist, they are there, and they are where people go for information nowadays. But we know that we cannot simply rely on putting our content there and then expecting people to come to us. So this is what we call here awareness of this platform traffic trap. And another associated issue here is that this group is becoming also more aware of the trade-offs of the clickbaiting strategy, in which many of them have engaged in previous years. So, of course, we still have many of these practicing the clickbaiting journalism, but there is ever more awareness we see in this group that this isn't giving us the return that we are expecting in terms of revenues. So you may get lots of traffic for a short time, but as I said, this is short-lived. And for the long term, this is not helping us a lot. So they are thinking about strategies. How do we cope with this? And we think we see this across all countries, this revenue model. Although in Spain we see still a larger importance of this traffic from platforms. In all other countries, we see a stronger pull away from this revenue stream, or this strategy of getting a revenue stream. And then we have everything else. We tried quite hard to cluster the models of the everything else, but I have the impression that if we would add 10 interviews to our sample from other outlets, we already would get another clustering here. So this is really provisional. But this tells also a story. Alternative content creators, non-profit organizations, activists that are working more on this boundary between traditional journalists and alternative content creators, they don't have a model. They don't have a model. What exists is something that is working for 2 outlets, something that is working for 2 other producers, and so on. In our sample, this is what we have seen, more or less. The first group is what we call the niche group. These are outlets or content creators that are working mostly with subscriptions, small ads, donations, and in some rare cases, some subsidies. They are focusing on very specific topics, ecology. And then they find people who are very keen to fund this kind of activity. They produce quality content in this very specific niche group, and they find a way to survive in this very specific niche. Second group is what we call platform monetization. This is the old dream story of platforms. Platforms said that they would make good content grow by offering the opportunity to monetize content offered on their space. YouTube, Google monetization, dynamic ads, this story. This still exists, especially among this group. They see revenues declining, they see instability, this is unstable, conditions deteriorating, but the group is still there. There are still people who are doing their media content activities based on this kind of revenue. The third group that we call here is the group of partnerships. These are persons or groups of people who strike a partnership or collaboration with a foundation, with an institution, with a company, sometimes also with grants, to cover specific topics that also have some support from these foundations. So we see this happening also in some countries in our sample. And it's a stable, small funding for most of the people who are working in this area. And then we have the volunteer group, which are people who are doing content voluntarily. And many of them claim that this is actually a model to keep their independence. So they even turn this as a positive factor for their role as content producers. Sometimes they also rely on micro donations, but mostly they think they are doing this with their own resources on their own. So this is what we see as the revenue models in general across our sample. Now let's delve deeper into some of the general developments that we see across these models. The first of them is that it's clear we are dealing with a mosaic of revenues. We are not dealing with a single, very specific, clearly identified revenue source. As we can say has been the history of media industry before. If we go to the literature, I mean, we decided in this presentation not to go deep into the literature, but if you go there, you see this discussion. There are basically two models. There is the publicly funded model, there is the commercial model. The commercial model is mostly subsidized by advertising. Sales plays also a role. It's very clear, boundaries very well defined. We now have nearly no boundaries. We have everything happening. And we will see some even more interesting examples of heterodox funding things. We see that public funding remains a stabilizer. So the countries that have a stronger public funding scheme, they have media which are more stable. And we didn't do a correlational study, but more or less anecdotally, we know from other studies, such as the Digital News Report, that these are also countries with higher levels of trust in the media ecosystem in general. So it's important to keep this in mind. But again, as said, political and inflation dynamics, they are harming this sector as well. And we have something that is becoming also an issue in many countries. We mentioned here Spain and Austria, which is the growing concern on public funds going via ads to private commercial media. This has always been there, so to say, but there is growing awareness that this is that states are choosing champions, and champions that for a coincidence, side with their own perspectives around ideologies. So there are growing discussions on banning public ads as a whole and moving altogether the budget to subsidy schemes which are more transparent, have more clear criteria, and so on. This is the scenario currently. And in the commercial legacy outlets, what we see is indeed this pivot to subscriptions and premium models. So when we see here subscription plus ads, this is not something that is moving stably on those two pillars. This is something that is ever more subscriptions and ever less ads. So we have indeed here a trend which is pretty clear, and many outlets shared with us their figures. In some cases, their nominal figures of what they are getting from ads and what they are getting from subscriptions. In some other cases, percentages. Many of them are bragging that they have more revenues from subscriptions than from ads, and the break-even was like 3-4 years ago. So this is the general trend among that second big revenue model. However, as said, many still face this structural pull towards traffic. So they are managing to move to a more premium membership relation in which they can count on a more stable revenue stream, and they don't need to do sensational coverage. They don't need to do this kind of clickbaiting thing, but this is still there, haunting journalists working in this area. So what we wanted also to highlight in the developments here is that the third pillars are becoming quite normal, which are things next to the public funding, and next to the subscriptions/ads model. Events, for example, it was quite a surprise for all of us how widespread this is across our sample as a source of revenues for media. Projects, consultancy, also other kinds of services cross-subsidizing journalism. We see this happening also nearly everywhere. We see branded collaborations, sponsorship formats normalized. This has been an issue for 20, 25 years in the field. Now it's normal. Raising these issues, the wall, the separation between newsroom and management, newsroom and advertising, even more pressing. And for alternative content creators, this is especially important. And this should raise our concern if we will develop further, depending on content or feeding our populations with content produced by these influencers, so to say. Also, some kinds of what some outlets are calling platform. They are trying to create themselves some platform and then attracting membership to build up this community, so to say. Besides this, we see some other interesting developments that we have to be aware of. So financialization and efficiency logic ever stronger than they have ever been. So this meaning cutting costs of investigation, especially cutting costs of correspondence, foreign correspondence, and so on. So administration that's pretty much financialized. We also see some media attempting the media tech strategy, becoming a type of tech company, investing in infrastructure and offering infrastructure services to clients, to customers. This is also a development. And we see then the story of the news deserts that has become pretty much in the US, has been very prevalent there. We see this also across our sample, although rather on a very local level. But this is growing. And this has been especially an issue that we have seen in interviews in the UK. In other countries, there is no desert, but we are seeing monopolies, local monopolies. Then outlets that manage to establish this kind of monopoly have then a bit of a more stable situation there. So it's the trade-off. Regarding platform power, we see that platforms are exerting power in this market structure, especially in how measurement is becoming a culture enshrined in how managers and journalists make decisions. So analytics, SEO, algorithmic discovery, this is steering coverage, and many journalists acknowledge this is also narrowing coverage because we need to match the figures. So second topic is not new, but still it pops up in the interviews. Algorithmic gateways, they have become dominant and at the same time opaque traffic sources. And we have journalists ever more complaining about this. And that is also one of the reasons why they are trying to pull away from this relation with getting away from a toxic relationship is always tough, and this is how journalists are trying to deal with platforms. But platforms provide a bit of different experiences, journalists and alternative content creators. So professionals they see on platforms more space for discovery. They also see on platforms, and especially they are seeing now on AI in interviews, some possibilities of workflow optimization and audience reaching, whereas for alternative content creators, they face way more the enforcement rule of platforms more directly. So, of course, journalists also complain about this, but journalists have a business away from platforms. These content creators usually they don't. So they are pretty much in the hands of platforms and the decisions that platforms make. Then I'm looking here at time. I have to rush a bit with my results. AI mediated search is appearing ever more across all interviews, and then what we call here the zero-click consumption, meaning content that AI is producing or search. This was already an issue with search. AI is only potentializing this. Summary of content, people get away with that summary, don't go to the original source. This is how platform power has been felt by journalists, threatening what they thought could be a sustainable business model based on linking. Link on search, link on platforms, and so on. In some cases, for example, in Norway, we have seen AI framed way more as a verification and cost burden, driving away resources from covering, verifying. They now have to check AI as well. So this shifts newsroom resources. Alternative content creators, we see way more openness towards AI. And this seems to be for the simple reason that they have less resources and they see in AI the possibility to do more. On the other hand, we have seen a very interesting development in some countries, established news producers seeing in the current situation a competitive opportunity, since they are the ones who can do human-only made content. I inverted here human-made only. Sorry, English sometimes is so tough for me. So there are only humans doing this. So we already see quite a few journalists thinking this may be a turning point, we may explore this. This is where people will come when they want to see what other people have done. Maybe it's a possibility, but it's a bit how they are feeling this platform power. In any case, platform governance is not just content moderation, as important as this is. For our groups of producers here, it's market structure, it's distribution infrastructure. So these are deeper layers in platform governance that I experienced. Last part of our findings, the impacts on the production of content, newsroom, content producers, how they deal with this. We see some soft capture of the current funding situation, some chilling effects. So, for example, we see independence risks coming from this kind of structure and not anymore from direct censorship. Although this is also not quite new. This has been also addressed, for example, in research about roles of journalists that rarely mention direct intervention, at least in Europe. They have more internalized self-censorship strains, so to say. So satisfying ads and sponsors and partners' expectations. So no one comes and tells you you have to cover this, but you know that you have to, because you have your boss telling you every week in the meeting that another advertiser has pulled away, and you don't have the budget. So you see public funding governance constraints also across several countries. And this is something that we also found interesting. Foundation funding restricting the focus of your coverage, the thematic focus. But what we also find quite striking is that across all interviews they say, this is making coverage way more difficult. This will make very problematic to be independent. And then we ask them, can you mention a concrete case in which you felt your independence was harmed? They never say something. So here I quote from a journalist from Czechia. We have asked, has it ever happened to you that your work has been restricted for economic reasons? Oh, I guess so. Sorry if I can't read this in Czech. I guess so, but I can't think of anything specific. Probably not really. I could always do it if I wanted to. I mean, tons of interviews in our sample, they say this. I can always do what I want to. They are negotiating their position. I am independent despite everything that I'm saying, the world falling apart here. I still do a very good job. So I picked here one quote, but as said, across the whole sample we have things like this. We also have as a reaction this kind of neutrality and some journalists really pushing traditional norms as a defensive posture to say we still believe in all of these core values of journalism and this is how we work here. So nothing will change even if revenues go down. This is what the work of a journalist must be and is. So we have, I'd say, even a bit lacking reflection, I'd say. So still thinking that the world is the same as 30 years ago. No? And we have this platform enforcement producing chilling effects for some alternative creators. I think we are over time, so I would move directly to this final part here, which are the main takeaways. If you agree, Mercedes?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for us, how do we summarize what we are seeing? And then, next and final slide, which risks do we see in that? First, there is no news business anymore. You cannot commercialize news, as it was the case 20, 30 years ago. This especially, so this is stronger in local independent media. So if you go national, if you go broader, if you have a conglomerate behind you, you can always cross-subsidize what you're doing. If you are a smaller, independent, local news provider, you cannot do away only with commercializing news. You need to have something else. You need to have the third pillars, and so on. So we do think that public funding must step in and must play a role. It cannot be the major role, and it cannot be the only role. But it must be there and must stabilize somehow media producing certain types of content, especially local content. And this must be done with independent safeguards. We see also that we have today a way more ambivalent relation with platforms and how platforms impact the market, growing awareness of these trade-offs of dealing with platforms, contestation of the benefits of platform traffic. So we even think that this is a very positive development, that we are having a reflection on this. And we see that from the perspective of journalists, and especially managers, the future looks way more like a mix of news and tech. So their business will be news plus tech somehow. But they don't know yet how. So they are trying alternatives, as said, investing in infrastructure. Some of them are investing on streaming, creating their own streaming platform. They know that, they think at least that the future will be this, news plus tech, and not only news. And which risks do we see in this situation then? In itself, these things can be good, mix of revenues and readership funding, which are two trends here, but they create some risks. So one risk is that with this cross-subsidizing thing, we have some pressure against independence. So we have other fields subsidizing the production of journalism. We already have questions. We have, for example, a podcast producer funded by an energy company to do a show on energy transition, and they know that this puts them in a situation that they cannot be also that critical regarding the mainstream solutions proposed, for example, by the company that sponsors the show. And we may have an oversized focus on business making, on going for these revenues, trying to find the revenue source instead of doing what we want journalists to do, which is content, covering issues, doing investigative reporting. So these are the risks that we see. The readership funding thing, people paying for news. We have way more people paying for news than, for example, 5 years ago. This is what our journalists, managers are saying. We have their tendency to these three types of coverage: elite coverage, national global coverage, and niche coverage, specific topics that people pay for. These are usually people who belong to an affluent group in society. So this tends to exclude already people that have always felt a bit underrepresented by traditional journalism. The tendency is that they feel ever less represented. So somehow, if we go for this, we have to find ways to counter this risk. Again, we are talking about risks. These things don't need to be true. These risks, we need to be aware about them, and we need to create measures to mitigate them. No? And then finally, this is an issue that sparked some attention yesterday when I said traditional journalism moving to what I call radical centrism, which is you stick to you stick to the middle of your funders, so to say, and you don't consider the questions, the issues raised by people that are on the fringes of society, especially on the political spectrum. And I said this yesterday, there is one reason why people are being radicalized. How they are being radicalized and the ideas that they are defending now may be totally wrong. And this is because politicians are exploiting this situation. But the reasons why they are falling for this, they are real and material, and it's necessary that journalists take this serious.
I'm sorry.
Okay, fire alarm. This is the situation of journalism, journalism funding, fire alarm. It's very well. So this is a risk that we think. Final and the biggest risk, in our opinion, and then we have put these two quotes here from interviews, is that the way the market is developing opens up a huge space for widening access inequality to premium, good coverage, investigative reporting, and to local information. And some journalists in our sample are aware of this. Here again, I quote one journalist from Czech and one journalist from Austria. The Czech journalist says that journalism moving behind a paywall is one of the biggest threats and undermines to democracy that we are seeing right now. What these journalists are thinking? Okay, we do all good content behind a paywall, behind a membership, premium thing, very good. This will be consumed by 15, 20% of the people. all other 80% of the population will get AI slop. This is what they will get. And this Austrian journalist has also reflected on the business model of his own company. We asked him, no plans for a complete paywall? No, no paywall. We are trying to create additional incentives, but not to exclude the general public, because there are people already aware about this risk. We have to tackle these risks, of course, and improve the funding situation. This is what we can find from our interviews. Thanks for listening to us.
Thank you, thank you. We have 15 minutes for Q&A. The microphone. Yes.
There is a question there.
Yes, yes, we're going to start. Yeah. Hello there, and thank you again for a very interesting presentation. I would like to comment a bit about these news deserts, which we have been talking about yesterday and today. They are growing all around the world and in Europe, also in Finland. The commercial media has or is less present in the not so in the regions where there's not so much population. That's pretty much the story. And for example, in Finland, also the public broadcasting company has reduced their presence because there's budget cuts now, like pretty big budget cuts for the broadcast company. We have a far-right party in the government which is pretty anti-national broadcasting company, so it shows here. But there is one exception, and that's the newspaper I'm working in. It's called Maaseudun Tulevaisuus. It translates somehow like the rural future or the future of the countryside. And it has been, I would say it has been a success story in the last 10 years. Because we are losing our print subscriptions, which is happening everywhere, but we are losing them more slowly than others. And on the other hand, in the last 10 years, we have gotten 6 times more web readers and I think it was like something like 7 or 8 times more web subscriptions than before. So we have a lot of new readers, like huge amount of new readers in the web, even though our print is slowly declining, but not so dramatically than other newspapers in Finland. And it's a big newspaper. It's the second most read in Finland. And I would think the success strategy has been going to different direction than the others. We have regional journalists in different parts of Finland. I'm one of them. I cover the central part of Finland. I don't live in the capital region. And most of my story trips are to countryside. And I also think it's kind of like socially important to have a big newspaper that listens to people who live in the regions and then tells their stories and their like problems and worries and also success stories which happen outside of the big cities. This term radical centrism, which I learned yesterday, it's very interesting, and it's even more interesting that we are pretty center, we are pretty moderate politically, like in between of the extremes. Like we are definitely not extreme left, not extreme right, something like in the middle, like very basic, hardworking Finnish people. But then we have this strong presence in the regions. So we are centrist, but we are in the regions, and it has worked. So there was this like there's no new business in the regions. Maybe there is, if it's offered.
Here, you want to collect?
There was someone.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, my comment was in the same topic than my colleague. I'm Pablo Eichel from EFJ, Vice President of EFJ, and also from France. And about media deserts, with EFJ and other partners. I don't remember all of them. And EUI, Center for Media Pluralism in Media Freedom, CMPF. We did a work on news deserts. It finished in 2024. It was presented in Brno in June 2024. All the countries in Europe were studied. So there is a very interesting landscape of the situation with red lights, yellow lights, green lights for each country. And it happens to show that in France, as you said, in France there are not really media desert. It's just monopoly of local information. 1 year after that, in 2025, sorry, a French foundation called Jaurès Foundation did a most deep study on media deserts in France, and it's called "Are Media Deserts a Threat to Democracy?" and show how there are media deserts in France and how this monopoly of local information newspapers are shrinking the presence of journalists in villages and or small cities, and how far right is rising there as in the United States. So it's also interesting to see this kind of investigation or work that Renate knows better than me. She was in Brno, I think. It's more or less one page on each country, but also when one country do the deeper investigation, we see the impact on this.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. I have actually 3 straightforward questions on 3 elements that caught my attention. The first one, so you mentioned events as a source of revenue. And I really like to ask, because actually this is also part of my PhD research, did you notice that events were also framed as a way to reconnect to audiences offline? And here actually I'm drawing a link between events as a source of revenues and also what you said about this need for human-made content. Because something that I'm witnessing in my research is actually some journalists are increasingly relying on these forms of community building initiatives, also actually to meet people offline, actually to kind of reconnect on an emotional level with them. So my first question is if you actually observe such a trend there. Second one is you mentioned you emphasized a couple of times that media companies are growingly pivoting towards tech. And I'd like to ask you whether you observed an increasing collaboration with also other actors. They can be NGO groups, they can be activists with H at the beginning, they can be digital experts, and whether you observe such a trend of a growing collaboration between media companies and actors that can help them to evolve towards these more basically what you call media tech. And the third one is more of a curiosity, because that's something that I'm also coming across in my research. So you said that many people, many journalists, when you interview them about concrete cases of potential risk to independence, they always say no. Actually, there's nothing that comes to mind. But what I noticed in my research, and I would like to hear your take on that, is that maybe when you ask them whether they are aware of other journalists being influenced, they always have examples. So if you interview a young journalist, he or she will tell you, yeah, because old people, they have more to lose. So of course, actually, their independence is more at risk. If you interview old journalists, they will tell you, yeah, young journalists are very vulnerable to external pressures. If you interview men, if you interview women, I observe this dynamic. So I'm very curious, actually, whether you also observe the same. But thanks again, because I think that this is a very valuable work. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, respecting the first question, definitely. I mean, events is a revenue of a new stream of revenues, and not all. I mean, not only to re-engage with the society, but definitely with the users, with the readers, with the viewers. they need to be in their lives, because as probably as we will see later on, there is this fatigue of the audiences, this separation from the interests of news and so on. So this is a way to be present in the cities and in the communities and so on. And not only events, but also education courses, masters, and so on. This is another way of revenues that most of them they are trying to develop. And the other question about the actors, I mean, obviously they are, but at least as I have seen, the connections are more with experts in different topics, that they are just trying to increase the news or to increase the coverage, taking the opinions of experts in different topics, and also the users. They desperately are looking for users. So they try to do different things to get the audience involved in what they are doing. This is what I...
A small addition to this point. NGOs, activists that you mentioned. From what I recall from our coding of the interviews, there is still very little engagement of traditional journalists with this kind of actors. What we have is alternative content creators engaging with this kind of actors, sometimes being even the same player. How I would explain this, I think traditional journalists still feel that they need to trace the boundary more clearly between what they do and what others do. It's like a positioning. And then when they move to tech, they think that they have to move by themselves, creating a product that is relevant, that can be sold, or that they do partnerships with a big platform or whatever to make their content more available, but with very clear boundaries. I'm not doing a Google thing, Google is not doing our thing. We strike a deal, and this may be relevant for me and for you. So these are 71 interviews, and we may have overlooked something in the coding, but this is the impression I have regarding your question. And regarding the issue of local journalism and the example of the colleague from Finland and the example of news deserts in France, I don't think that these both realities that they necessarily contradict the general picture. So we are talking here about, we are doing a generalization, of course. The generalization means that if we would have obvious conditions to make local journalism work in Europe, this would be widespread. And it's not. Actually, we are seeing the other way around. So does this mean that it doesn't work nowhere? No, it doesn't. So we also have in our sample some cases in which it works, they find some ways, but then you have to look at the peculiarities of those specific conditions to see why it's working there. An interesting follow-up in our research could be doing specific case studies, looking at your company, looking at another company. Unfortunately, we could not do this now. But I think that there are examples of things that are working and they should be tried. But I think we have a more structural problem that it doesn't get solved so easily. And the news deserts, well said, the main issue in Europe is not yet news deserts. So you see these slowly growing, mostly in the UK in our sample. So the main issue has been local monopoly. and then we could have a long discussion here to what extent this is bad or good. Because we have this normative tradition in media studies, especially in media ownership studies, that concentration and monopoly are always bad. I don't think that we really had a poorer information ecosystem 40 years ago in Europe when you had monopoly of public service broadcasters, for example. Do we really need more news? I mean, I have just finalized a text submitted for a journal where the last sentence is, we actually need better news, not more. And so maybe there is a way to live with local monopolies of journalism that is beneficial for society, and that if we try to break up this kind of monopoly, we may disrupt the whole conditions of news production there. Maybe we can solve the issue of pluralism in another way. We have had discussions in academia about internal pluralism, for example. But this is not a topic of today, I assume. No?
Thank you very much.
Discussion.
Thank you. Maybe the next panel, Nicole and Alice can provide some solutions with media regulations and law, and how media regulations and law could do that. We'll see. All right. So the floor is yours, Nicole and Alice.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
We're all coming out. We have a whole delegation.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry. Apologies. These are the names they gave me. So.
Thank you. No, we wanted to. We also feel as though we need to have some energy before lunch, probably.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
We wanted to do it a little bit differently.
I think only one mic is working.
Oh,
So
right.
I have to check.
We talk about diversity, so this is.
We did.
Oh, so this one is not
We're
working?
diversity.
Well, actually, it's not. Yeah, it's all female diversity. is
Thank
number
you. We noticed this as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we definitely noticed this. Is this working?
I think it's not working. We need to switch this. Anyone knows the source here? Can you see the source? Because I think the source is.
Great. So as we pull up the PowerPoint, I'll just go ahead and start to introduce our panel.
Yeah, I think it's that.
Because it's really been, I think, speaking for the Oxford team, it's really been a pleasure to work with the team from Charles University over the last 3 years. It's been a wonderful collaboration, and so it's also nice that we can all be here together on this final panel. And so I'm Nicole Strumlaw, Professor of Law and Society in the Digital World at Oxford, and I'm here with two of my colleagues also from Oxford, Juliana Mota and Natalia. And we're sort of a diverse, we've been, some of you, I think this is probably the first time you met Natalia, and Juliana's been with the project for a little bit longer, but we also see these EU projects as a really special opportunity to get scholars involved at various stages of their careers. So Juliana just finished her master's in human rights law, and Juliana just finished her DPhil a few months ago as well. So also at Oxford in the law faculty. So it's really been wonderful to also have the opportunity to work together from our side. So we thought that we'd have it a bit as a conversation, also to just give a different rhythm to the day. And so I will turn it over now to Alice, who's going to start by discussing a little bit about the aspects that Charles University worked on.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It was. Maybe I
No,
will.
I don't know if it's easy.
Yes.
That works, and also the
Great.
remote works if you want.
Oh.
Normally. Normally it should work. I don't know.
Okay.
So also if you have any questions, you're free to interrupt us as
Yeah.
we discuss if that's okay.
To start with, I would also like to thank to the Oxford team and all the partners, because it was such a great pleasure to be the part of the consortium. I'm here with 3 of my colleagues, almost the whole team now, Kateřina Turková, Anna Shavit, and Viktoria Najnova. We left only 2 people home, so we were quite a big team also. And we started the work in the first phase. You've already heard from Vito in his presentation that in the first phase we were mapping existing regulations We published a report on that, and we also had a collaborative paper also with the Oxford team that was presented at the ECRA conference. And then we had this paper published as a chapter in a book that Katka is going to speak more about. So we were. Is anything wrong, George?
Sorry?
Is anything wrong? Because
No. I was just, in order for you to use this, I needed to put a USB in the computer.
Okay.
That's all. Sorry.
Thank you. I was like,
That's all.
I didn't know if there aren't any technical
No.
issues. As you can see, since the report was published in spring 2024, it's been a while, so the data from that were not so recent, but on the other hand, we could see some trends that were also captured by the European legislature, and they further inspired policy papers that were also collaborated later with other data collection. Then we were focusing on task 4.2, that was to examine algorithmic pluralism in the hybrid media system. And we were trying to focus especially on the relationship between media and democracy, and how the democratic values are rooted in the hybrid media system. We, as everyone here from the project and from the consortium, focused on these three groups of stakeholders: professional journalists, alternative media content producers, and citizens. And it was really interesting to see especially the relationship, if I stay in the framework of our work package that was focused on the legislation, how people perceive the European legislation, and I'm sure that's almost same in all the countries. So we discussed it quite a lot at the international conference in Prague, and Katka will tell something about the book that was recently published on February 5th this year. That's about the regulation and other things. So yes, it's okay to go to international conference. No, sorry, yes, I wanted to go to the international conference. Yes, it was it was fine. Thank you. So the international conference that was focused on the regulation and accountability was a really fruitful meeting, because we got there quite a lot of people from the Central European region, and also decision makers there, and people from NGOs, and also from the European Commission. So it was interesting to discuss the issues. The pictures were taken by Renate Schroeder, who was also here, and I used her pictures from our Remed social media. And on the first one, there's Věra Jourová, who used to be the vice president of the European Commission, and she was very open when she was speaking, for example, about the media regulation in the context of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's quite interesting. We also have an interview with her in a book that I'm going to speak later about. And it was extremely interesting how open she was about the kind of regulation of Russian propagandist bots and all the troll farms and everything else. So it was really interesting. And we also did it as a joint event with Mapping Media for Future Democracies Horizon project that was also supported in the same call as was our REMET project. Just to talk briefly about the other book, then Katka is going to speak about. It is connected with the declining democracies, and it is deliverable for the work package 2 that's edited by Anna Shavit, Carlo Berti, me, and Verica Rupar. And we also have there the whole chapter about backsliding democracies that is built on the political science background our colleagues have. So anyone is interested in backsliding democracies, they can also discuss it in our work package. And what we believe is really important are the lectures that we could take from the data. I will speak about some recommendations at the end of my part, but now it's Katka's turn.
Yes. Okay. Now I will talk about the edited volume that that was just published last week, finally. And firstly, I would like to thank all the contributors from the REMAT consortium and also out of the REMAT consortium that contributed with their chapters to this book. And because we started with a publication and proposal suggestion procedure quite early on, and also when basically I think that it was half a year after the project start, there were also already some initial preparation stages. So I understand that it was quite a busy period for all of you. So thank you very much that you contributed, and I'm happy that I can see many people that contributed here. Nicole, Alice, Anna, Victoria, and also the Spanish team who contributed with their valuable inputs on the legislation part. And this book covered 4 aspects that are connected to the threats, disinformation and regulation in the European digital environment, which are the trusts in disinformation. There were chapters that were related also to the COVID-19 disinformation that were then not considered to be as remet challenges in the further part of the project, but we reflected on them a bit in this book. And also obviously war in Ukraine, and also the disinformation that are connected to the people with the migrant background. That was a very interesting chapter written by Ana Azurmendi from the Spanish team. The second part was dedicated to the approaches to disinformation and the good practices, how to tackle them, avoid them, or fight with them. And in this part, there were also contributions that were from other countries than those that are involved in REMAT consortium. For example, from Croatia or from Romania. There was a chapter that was dedicated to the public policy support related to these issues. That was quite interesting as well. The third part, dedicated to the regulation, is I think very actual still. Despite the publication process is always long, so I think that in this case we managed to tackle the EU legislation and also some issues connected to that, as well as the law that is related to the things happening in the specific countries under study, for example, the new Spanish law on journalism and media. And the last part is dedicated to the current challenges, especially hate speech and also the visual content, the visual disinformation or misinformation published in the media, which I think that in the age of AI, it is a good closing chapter of this book, and it then gives us space to some follow-up. So again, thank you, and I hope that you will enjoy reading it.
Thank you very much. I would end our part with the recommendations, because as a former journalist, I am always pressured by the situation of the academic publishing that's really long, and we are doing things that are very recent and need to be published quickly. So that's why we also developed several papers that were published in the Czech media, and we also organized workshops with the journalists, because we believe that it is important to do things also during the project. What was quite controversial, but very controversial in the terms of acceptance, but we believe that it is really important. that we realized that the communication that is connected with the new legislation is very formal, and the institutions are afraid of the connection with the influencers, and they have the issues with that. But there are many influencers who would like to contribute, those who are named as not contrarian but more like supportive to the liberal democracies, who would like to help and to be connected with them and to explain the legislation really like much earlier than when it's already in charge is very important. And what we realize that it's important for citizens and communities and general public. What we realized is also important is to engage key stakeholders, journalistic organizations, journalists active at social media, and influential in journalistic communities, to have a kind of joint workshop to develop a kind of strategies how to include them into the communication, for example, about the disinformation spread and information verification exactly inside the journalistic community. It is something that, of course, raises the level of engagement and also a kind of accountability, personal accountability of people to do it. And it is something that we can definitely recommend. And last but not least, it's what is important in the legislation is usually to restrict things that are bad. But we realize that it's extremely important to think about the content that could be working and could be working positively into communities, and not only in the harmful way, because the restriction usually creates also a kind of big opposition, and when it is framed in a much more positive way, it's much better accepted. So that's from Charles University team, and now it's time for the Oxford.
Thanks so much. So just to build on what my colleagues from Charles University said, we took sort of the second half of the project, and one of the major streams within our work package was looking at the role of fact checkers. So also I'm trying to understand who these fact checkers were, how they think about the work that they're doing. And I think when this project was drafted, and thanks so much to the foresight of the team from Navarra, and the team from Agdar University, Vita, Abit, Mercedes, and everyone, we didn't realize that fact-checking was going to be such a political issue. And I think it's been really interesting for us to have this part of the work package and to see this unfold over the duration of this Horizon project. Because I think, as most of you will know, there's been, unfortunately, with the disaster situation of the Trump administration, there's been a lot of pressure on social media platforms to change their policies towards fact-checking. And so we've seen the hollowing out of this sector. We've seen massive reductions of funding, at least in the United States, and we've seen a lot of concern and real worry about where the future of fact-checking is going to go, not only as it's affected by the relationship it has with platforms, as well as its relationship with AI. So we'll be discussing that a little bit. If you can just go to the next one. Thank you so much. So as part of our fact-checking research, we did and thanks very much to the RIMED team, we did a number of semi-structured interviews within the RIMED countries, but we also reached out to Romania, Italy, and Greece. And this really focused on ideas of legal consciousness. And my colleague Juliana will unpack this a little bit more, what exactly we meant by this. But we were trying to understand the legal frameworks and the soft norms that were guiding the fact-checkers' work. So how they were really thinking about the work that they were doing, and how they were interacting with a plurality of different laws and frameworks and community standards coming from platforms as well, and specifically looking at the influence and the role of the International Fact-Checking Network, which is an organization that's based in the United States at the Poynter Institute, and that basically defines a lot of the rules that fact-checkers, certain fact-checkers, and this is something that I'll also return to, are supposed to adhere to. And so If you're a member of the IFCN, then you're eligible for funding from Meta's third-party fact-checking program, for example. So it's also sort of a gatekeeper and defines and accredits who can be a fact-checker according to certain rules and certain norms and a certain group on that side. We also decided to do a survey, and I think this was really important, and it wasn't originally in the project, but we wanted to go beyond the scope of the project because we also wanted to think about what was happening in Europe in a wider global context. And I think this was also really important for us because I think a lot of what you see happening in the rest of the world can tell you a lot about what is unique or what might happen here in Europe as well. So we reached more than 100 fact checkers from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And so we wanted to draw in this sort of like global perspective. And through this survey, we asked questions again about the fact checkers' governance framework. We were able to reach fact checkers that weren't just in the IFCN, for example. We were looking at the key actors that were influencing their operations, the relationship with funding. We asked questions around how these groups and organizations perceive their role, what their interactions are with big tech, for example. And we also were trying to understand the differences, as I mentioned, between fact checkers in Europe as well as in global South countries in terms of the challenges to their work and also their use of technology that's provided by big tech platforms, as well as the technology that's being developed by fact-checking organizations like FullFact, for example. As part of this research, we've also been organizing, we had a workshop in Oxford, and thanks so much to the teams from Navarra and those from Charles University that were there with us. And we really used it as a way of refining the special issue that we have coming out with Harvard Kennedy's misinformation review. So we had an opportunity for all of the participants that we sort of shortlisted their papers to present their papers, receive feedback, and then we also paired people up in sort of a peer review process to get additional feedback and additional input on their work. And I think what was also unique about this workshop and also why we decided to go with this particular journal is that we involved fact checkers and civil society groups in the workshop. And so within this journal, there's also space for non-academic papers. So they have these like policy review inputs. And so we actually have some fact checkers that are contributing to the special issue. And we were also fortunate because we also had technologists there. So we had the person that's designed FullFact's AI system, which is the new automated fact-checking system that they're trying to, it was initially sponsored by Google, it had funding by Google to launch, but they're trying to, as they've also been facing reductions from platforms, they're trying to scale out this new platform as a way of also improving their business and working with other fact-checking organizations, primarily in the global South, to better automate the fact-checking work that they're doing. The next slide, before I turn it over to my colleagues, I just want to say a couple of findings also that we were exploring, and I know Natalia will speak a little bit about the relationship with the DSA, between fact checkers and trusted flaggers in the DSA. But I think one of the things that we saw and why taking this global perspective and how it reflects back on Europe was so important was we see some of the trends and challenges happening elsewhere in the world amplified, and they can tell us about some of the difficulties. For example, a lot of the fact-checking organizations in the Global South are much more dependent on platforms such as Meta for funding. Some of them are almost entirely funded by Meta. And so what this switch, this idea from third-party fact-checking program to this community notes is going to mean is it's going to have a very serious effect on the work that they're doing. We also see many more fact checkers outside of Europe using this platform and rating system that was provided by Meta. So they're using the infrastructure of big tech, which is pushing what needs to be fact checked to them. And I think this is also really interesting when you start to unpack it because it's pushed to them in certain languages, which are then reinforcing certain algorithms and enabling the platforms to try to do more automated fact-checking. And this isn't necessarily the same in Europe, but I think we see sort of it helps us to think in a more nuanced way about the governance, the rules, the community standards that are coming from the platforms themselves in terms of defining what is a fact check, what should be fact checked, how do you legitimately fact check something, and the rules in which that are then implemented and then become very much part of the training data when it comes to automated fact checking, as Juliana will speak a little bit about. And we also see how it's, for many, the sort of move towards fact-checking that we saw, this great enthusiasm around it in the COVID period, in the post-COVID period, was a frontline response to the drastic failures in content moderation. So, if Meta, I think one of the challenges is if Meta's moving to these community notes, as they've been speaking about, this new sort of model, also in places like the Global South, one of the challenges is that we've seen with flagging, for example, what about countries that flag much less than other countries? And those, again, tend to be countries with low resource languages. So some people have said before, during one of our interviews with one of the platforms, that all of Africa combined flags as much as Germany. And so you have vast differences also in terms of how these community notes for fact-checking will be implemented. And I think we see these inequalities, yes, between the Global North and the Global South, but we're also going to see them in Europe, because in Europe you have many European Somali speakers, many European Amharic speakers. You have, of course, very different, you have high resource languages and low resource languages within Europe, for example, Romanian versus French. So these inequalities are going to become more and more entrenched with this sort of shift that we see. And finally, I'd say one of the things that also emerged from some of our conversations, particularly at the workshop, and the timing of this event and the timing of this research, is thinking about fact-checking in this period of geopolitical reordering. So we see shifting debates around legitimacy. What kind of fact-checking is legitimate? And I think here, seeing big tech reacting to what the Trump administration is doing as Trump is undermining ideas of truth. Who can determine facts? I mean, fact checkers are now framed in terms of censors, essentially, threats to freedom of expression. And we see this language increasingly being weaponized. And one of the challenges, I think, that as we think about next stages of our research as well, that came to us particularly during the workshop, and I think one of the weaknesses in our data collection was that we over-relied on the international fact-checking network. So we over-relied on it in terms of the fact-checking organizations that we attempted to interview or reach out to in Europe, but also globally. And I think because you see competitive organizations, so you see, for example, the GFCN, which is the global fact-checking network that has been started by Russia. But you see a lot of, in the Global South, they are attracting fact-checking organizations to subscribe, to access money, to access training with them. I think Singapore has started an alternative fact-checking network as well, because the IFCN doesn't allow state fact-checkers to be members of it and to be accredited by the IFCN. So you also see this sort of competition that's happening right now in terms of what is a legitimate fact-checking organization? Who can a fact-checker actually be? And it has a big impact on what organizations are prioritizing and why. So I want to turn over to Juliana, I think, who'll say a few words about how this algorithmic pluralism, or how this legal consciousness is becoming embedded into ideas of the ways in which fact-checking is becoming automated.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for this overview. I think it was a brilliant overview of all of the project and some of our findings. And we are now working on a paper, so it's a work in progress. It's going to be really good to get some feedback and some questions. We still have some time to adjust the paper a little bit. So we're working on the legal consciousness of fact checkers. For further context, so we are based in the Center for Social Legal Studies at the Oxford University. That means we try to bring in the legal frame over all of these things that we mentioned. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term legal consciousness, it's quite simple. It's basically how people perceive the law and how the law impacts their daily activities. So our main question when analyzing the data from the interviews, and again, I need to reiterate, thank you very much for all of our partners who collected the data with us. When we analyzed the data, the main question that we asked was, what is the legal consciousness of fact checkers? So how do they perceive the law? And why is it important to understand their legal consciousness? Because of three reasons. So first of all, very academic one, it's a gap in the literature. So we have a very good place there to write about it. Second, because fact checkers, they're under different legal systems. So they not only interact with the law of the state, as the DSA, as we just mentioned, but also journalism laws, but they also interact with the law of the platforms themselves, as we just mentioned. When they're members of the 3PFC, they need to comply with what Meta tells them to do, and more than that, they need to comply with the algorithms of Meta. And third, because they have their own internal organizations and their own internal codes of conduct, which also become law for them. In the case that we mentioned, the IFCN, and we also had a look at the EFCSN, the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. So because they're under these three different legal systems, we wanted to understand how do they perceive the law and how these legal systems interact amongst themselves, and for the production of fact-checking. So just a brief overview on the literature on legal consciousness. Usually the authors, they say that there are three ways that people can perceive the law. So the normative way, the law exists, is an object of disinterest and action. They're there, the law is there, I don't do anything, I just comply, that's it. The second way is the pragmatic. The law can be used to strategically advance people's goals. So I know the law exists, but I actually interact with that strategically. And then the third way is a critical one. The law is based on structures of power and it needs to be challenged. So I'm going to find ways to resist the law. And we apply this theoretical framework to understand how fact checkers perceive, first of all, the state laws, the state and international laws, so the DSA and journalistic rules, national rules, their own norms of conduct, the IFCN and the EFCSN, and the rules of the platforms. And we found that, first of all, when interacting with state law, especially the DSA, it was an object of disinterested action. So they understand that the DSA is there, but they don't really perceive the DSA as doing anything for them, either good or bad. It's just there. They don't really work with the DSA. Second, when analyzing their own norms of conduct, so the IFCN and the EFCSN, sorry about that, they perceive that as the main driving forces of their work. So they comply with the IFCN. Some of the organizations were actually funded thinking about how to comply and how to apply for membership of the IFCN because they wanted to access, as Nicole said, the third-party fact-checking program of Meta. And in order to do so, they need to be members of the IFCN. So it's really clear how the norms of the IFCN and their own journalistic codes of conduct drive fact-checking work. So it's not an object of disinterest action. Actually, when they analyze the IFCN and the norms and journalistic codes of conduct, they use it strategically to advance their own goals. And third, we had mixed perceptions when we asked them about the codes of conduct of the platforms and the algorithms of the platforms. So they said, some of the fact checkers, they said themselves that there is a dashboard and Facebook directs content to them so that they can fact check. But they kept repeating that in any case, they were completely independent and autonomous, so that didn't mean anything. They could still actually do whatever kind of fact checking that they wanted, even if it was not in the dashboard. So the law is not necessarily neutral. Actually, they understand that there is a position of power of Facebook when providing this dashboard to them, but it's also used strategically. So we found that there was a shift in the normative framework there that couldn't account for these different normative systems that fact checkers were under. And most interestingly, when we talked about the rules of the platforms itself, so the rules of the third-party fact-checking program, we found some resistance to these laws. Natalia is going to go more into detail, but one of the most interesting rules that we had was that fact-checkers cannot fact-check political content, which I see some people saying, what? Yeah, that is correct. So Facebook doesn't pay for any political fact-checking that the fact-checkers do. And of course, fact checkers don't like that because their primary function historically was to fact check politicians. So they try to find ways to resist the law through different ways. So these were our findings. And then you can ask me, this is really interesting, but why does this matter in the end of the day? So 2 reasons. First of all, it's really interesting to see how fact checkers perceive the law so that we can actually create laws that can be used by them strategically. We realize that the DSA seeks to tackle misinformation, but it doesn't mention fact checkers anywhere. And in the end of the day, fact checkers themselves, one of the main actors to tackle misinformation, don't perceive the DSA as being influential at all. So we need to understand how they use their own laws and own internal code of conduct in order to create laws that are effective and they are going to advance their strategic goals. And secondly, and this is where Nicole mentioned a bit more, is to understand how algorithms and AI systems, they standardize these notions of legality that fact checkers themselves have. One of the things that fact checkers commented with us is that whenever they input something into Facebook's third-party fact-checking program, is that they can click for an AI to go on and search for other misinformation based on the misinformation that they've just verified. So the moment that they insert their verifications into this tool, they're actually codifying their own legality. So whatever went into their mind and whatever they considered when doing that specific fact checking is now codified into a code, into AI. And this AI is going to, of course, reproduce biases and reproduce the legalities that they've just seen. So using the example of Facebook, for instance, if Facebook's AI doesn't have any kind of political fact-checking, in the end of the day, it's just going to continue to reproduce biases against political fact-checking in itself. So these were some of our findings and some of the discussions that we're having, and try to understand how exactly do we codify that into AI and what are the issues. Again, it's a work in progress. We want to submit in the coming weeks, but there is still scope to discuss some of these findings. And now I'm going to move on to Natalia to talk a bit more about the political fact-checking and go into details of this shocking finding that we had.
So we can just add it here on Juliana's point. So I think one of the really, really interesting things, and also about, because we also interviewed some trusted flaggers, but I think one of the really interesting things is just how these fact checkers are trying to navigate all of these different legal norms and rules, and then what it means in how it becomes sort of entrenched in these new, because I think within the last year, because we've seen this drastic funding cuts, there is this new push to try and automate fact-checking as much as possible. So of course they're reinforcing it on these data sets by fact-checkers that are mostly part of the third-party fact-checking program, so it sort of has this self-reinforcing loop.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Juliana. So for my section, I'll be talking about some of what Juliana brought up, which is the relationship between platforms and fact-checkers. And I think the study of fact-checkers within the previous months has been really interesting, given, as Nicole, what you mentioned, the framing of fact-checkers as censors, and the fact...
And this was, I should say, because you also, sorry, that's a cut you off, Natalie, because you did the draft of this policy brief.
Yes.
As well. So this is what it comes from, and thanks so much to Nico and Avid for all of their help with it.
So what I'll be reviewing and discussing and summarizing is the policy brief, which you can also find on the website, on the Remit website, if you want to read in full. And I think the framing of fact-checkers as censors is really interesting, given the particularities of their commercial relationship with platforms, and the fact that at the end of the day, fact-checkers' role within the scope of these partnerships is to do research and to help suggest what content might be misleading or false, but ultimately it is the platform's decision, in the case of Meta's third-party fact-checking program, to do the content moderation decisions. And so for this policy brief, one of the things that was brought up, as Juliana also mentions, is the role of the Digital Services Act, how it is in dialogue and interacts and is present within the context of these platform relationships, and how fact-checkers see it. And I think one of the findings is that fact-checkers view the European legislation as currently rather insufficient, that it still remains too dependent on platforms' goodwill. for addressing disinformation on their platforms. So in the survey that we conducted that gathered responses from 12 European countries, one of the questions that was asked to respondents is whether in their country they consider that social media platforms recognize the importance of fact-checking content on their platform. And the response was that about 64% lean toward disagreeing that currently social media platforms did. And one of the discussions within the policy brief is, of course, the kinds of inherent clash between platforms' commercial and financial logics and the aims of addressing information disorder from these fact-checkers. And here comes in also the problem of the exclusion of political speech under the third-party fact-checking program, which is one of the most controversial, I think, parts of the policy and has been really criticized by the international fact-checking network. And so under Meta's policies, if you look at the program policies with fact checkers, Meta clearly says that any post or ads from politicians or even created on behalf of or directly quoting a politician or their campaign is not eligible to be fact checked. And so Meta justifies this exclusion in the idea that within, and this is also fact checkers' understanding of this rule, is that it is justified according to the idea that within a democracy, political speech is already heavily scrutinized. And so fact checkers are not able to link or label any explanatory articles to false or misleading information shared by, quote, within the Meta policy, candidates running for office, current office holders, many of their senior appointees, along with political parties and their leaders. And so this is a broad definition of who constitutes a political actor within the scope of this program policy. And it means that disinformation spread by politicians essentially is able to be shared on social media platforms, which relegates fact checkers to often feeling that they can only fact check kind of anonymous, small reach actors in the online space. So this is also a clear problem, as well as I think highlights an asymmetric power relationship between the fact checkers and the platforms, also in terms of the steps and the efforts that fact checkers have taken in order to request and demand more clarity around actually what is the definition of a political actor by Meta. Another issue that came up is inconsistent content moderation practices across social media platforms. So, of course, we know the third-party fact-checking program by Meta is really, as cited by our interviewees, a benchmark model. But we also have, of course, other social media partnerships, such as TikTok, and these also show differing approaches to what they do with disinformation. So something that came up is what content moderation decision is taken in response to false information. Is the information labeled as misleading or as false? Is it de-amplified? Is it removed? And so there's also reports of insufficient transparency when it comes to the content moderation decisions that platforms take in response to misleading content, but also a sense by fact checkers, and I think that this was, for me as a researcher, interesting as well, that something that fact checkers repeatedly brought up is they're not interested, of course, in being censors. They're interested in contributing to more valuable and accurate debate. And so when platforms take the decision to remove misleading or false content entirely, it actually can go against the aims of fact checking and contribute to this false notion that fact checkers are somehow trying to censor the online space. And finally, as Nicole also mentioned, is the heavy financial reliance that a lot of fact checkers exhibit with these social media platforms. And of course, this would be pronounced in the Global South, but even within our interviewees, we heard even discussion around, the creation of fact-checking organizations in Europe with the purpose or the idea that they could receive funding from these social media platforms and therefore have this space to amplify their fact checks. And from our surveys, 96% of those surveyed indicated that the financial was a big challenge, a top challenge for their organization in the coming months. I think also another challenge that was mentioned by Nicole was the issue of low resource languages and how fact checking and how the accuracy of the online space as well it greatly differs between kind of minority groups and majority groups, but also along linguistic lines as well. We had interviews that were talking about the fact that, you know, in their countries, these social media platforms will have one fact checker that is fluent in their language, which severely reduces the efficacy of their work as a result. And so about 20% of the fact checkers that we surveyed indicated that language barriers was a top challenge to their work. Yeah, I think that's it from the policy brief, but yeah, a more detailed overview of this is available on the website, and thank you, Vito, as well for organizing this.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Everyone wants to go to lunch.
Well, we'll have some time later as well.
No, thank you. Just a couple of comments and provocation. You don't need to answer, but I thought the legal consciousness breakdown you gave is very interesting, and I think it would be interesting even with the other work with other actors. But I'm thinking about a fourth category there, and I don't know if it's fact checkers or perhaps on other actors, professional journalists. I mean, critiquing the law is not just resistance, it's also wanting to improve, and I don't think it's just strategic. Isn't there a fourth category there? That would be one question. And the second thing, more or less a provocation, I think from the dire picture you're giving on fact-checking, I mean, perhaps the notion of fact-checking deserts, that we talk a lot about news deserts, but what is it with countries having one fact-checker? It sounds, yeah, really scary. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I mentioned the three categories just because it's what the literature established, but one of our findings and one of the things that we mentioned in our study is that they're not necessarily fixed, and especially in systems where legal pluralism is very evident, which is in the case of fact checkers, these categories are not as fixed as we imagine. So originally the literature was dealing with other things, with like more classical standards of law, so that's why they only provided three categories. But I completely agree with you, a fourth one would definitely exist. It's just interesting, especially in our case, when we look at the DSA, for instance, even though they don't feel like it's helping them in any way, they're also not trying to improve it necessarily. They just say it doesn't work and that's it. When we talk about the Meta's rules, then we have a shift because we see patterns of resistance, and we've had some fact checkers actually saying that they've tried to talk to Meta and they've tried to change the rules, and in some instances, not when it comes to political fact checking, but in some other cases of other rules, they actually managed to change the rules. So yes, that's definitely a fourth category.
I'll say something about the fact checking deserts. I think that's a really interesting provocation. I guess, you know, when we started this research, there's so much work that's been done on fact-checking. So it's a very, very heavily researched field. There's been a lot of work on like how effective fact-checking is. And I think, we were speaking about it after our last conference in Oxford, where we had all of the presentations, we had fact-checkers there. I personally was feeling a bit dispirited because I felt like and I know we have colleagues here from the Global Forum on Media Development, because I sort of felt like this was within that category, and it was sort of going that direction of the media development field, because it was like they're fighting after the same funding. Then there was this of foundations or international organizations, and then there were the groups that had really started to get money from the third-party fact-checking program. And a lot of those groups, particularly in the Global South, you only have to do 2 fact checks a month to be an accredited fact checker. And there's been so little work to really understand, and okay, let's take hypothetically, I don't know, Asmara check. It doesn't exist, but if Asmara check, people hold this up as saying, oh, Eritrea has a great fact-checking organization, but then you really look at the work that they're doing, and they're doing 2 fact checks a year. Sometimes it's, it's quite problematic, I think, when you start to dig deep. So I think it is something that's worrying. I think it's a very, very fragile ecosystem, and it's just going to become more fragile. And I think our concern then was thinking about, as it shifts to this more automated phase, this effort to automate it, what is actually being automated? Like whose values, whose ideas? what is the sort of corpus of fact checks that people are building systems on and around?
What I would like to add also in the context of what we heard about the possible revenues, the issue and funding, what was extremely interesting for us as mainly people from journalism studies at the workshop in Oxford was how the fact checkers are moving also in the field of investigative journalism, and how they are also going into commercial projects like kind of consultancy, how it can also influence their fact-checking initiatives, how difficult it is. They were very open also about the discussion of how it could ethically influence them, so how they are going to divide the sectors they are doing. So some of the branch of the company, when they are bigger fact-checking organizations, one part is doing investigative journalism, the other one is doing fact-checking, and the other one is doing consultancy. So they are not crossing the interests. And it was really like interesting how they quite actively influence the field of journalism, and they are definitely very strong peripheral actors now, and they are competing again with journalists more than ever about the space in the journalistic field.
Look, I live in Poland, and maybe that's not typical for the rest of the world, but I mean, what you're talking about is the truth. That's the word, and that's a word. And some other words also have been debased. I mean, you're working in an environment where the basic word truth is not taken seriously. If I want to make people laugh at a dinner party, I say, that's not true. And people go, ha ha, what's truth? Come on, everyone has their own truth. It seems that you're working, I mean, that you're doing great stuff, but you're doing it on a petri dish. You're just looking at the thing. But the real problem is that people are lying and people are accepting that. It's extraordinary to think that Meta will not check if politicians are telling the truth or not, given that I think it's an offence in the United Kingdom to lie to Parliament, a politician lying to Parliament. That is, I think it was Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson lied to the House of Commons, and that I think he had serious legal problems, because if you're the Prime Minister, you're not supposed to lie. But actually, this is a problem. This is a much wider problem than working out if someone has access to an association or what Meta is saying. It's a problem that certain norms are being debased in our society, and we have to solve that. Sorry, thank you.
If I only may to comment there, because the book we are currently working on is not the media in times of backsliding democracy, a European perspective. It's not only the typical research-based edited volume, but it also includes 3 interviews with people like Ellen Rusbridger or Věra Jourova or Amanda Magnani, quite shooting star of journalism, Brazilian who used to study in Europe, and she has great perspective also on sustainability and totally new approach to giving the voice to the people she is covering, because she works as a journalist. And regarding the issue of truth, we are of course discussing it a lot in the interviews, and what is or what isn't true is ideological, definitely, because people are not even bothering themselves to verify facts. It is something that is very hardly acceptable for me, because I believe that when you have, for example, the numbers, they say it quite clearly what's wrong or what isn't. But everyone can anyhow distort the reality in their conversations, and it is quite a big issue. What we realized in the interviews and also by the research methods that what really matters is the authenticity and the relevance for the community, and really like the very open perspective towards your audience, that it is something that really matters. There are still audiences who are willing to pay for that and who are willing to support the media like that, and it is something that's even though the reality, even though of course it's constructed, is quite depressive, as you said in your comment. I could see the light at the end of the tunnel, that there are things that are quite encouraging actually and happening within the current media.
Hello, my name is Nafisa. I'm head of Media Ownership Monitor program at Global Media Registry. I would like to go back to the regulation, and maybe this is a stupid question, but the way I understand fact checkers are in the space between civil society and journalism. But is there actually any regulation on fact checkers? And is there a legal definition of fact checking apart from what Meta has?
We've asked in our interviews if there were any national laws or any like more regional laws that we were not aware of, just to understand if there was a legal definition, if they were bound by any laws directly targeted fact-checking, and the answer is no. So yeah, in theory they are within civil society, journalism. We found some people who were in academia and they perceived themselves as fact-checkers. We found fact-checkers saying that although they saw themselves as journalists, they wouldn't like to portray themselves as journalists because of the impact that they could have in the eyes of the broader society. So it is a heavily regulated field, even though it's not a very regulated field in itself with targeted regulation. But there are other regulations that still come to play. For instance, many of them cited, the national rules on privacy, for instance, they come into play and I'm bound by them. Some of them who are more, who are embracing the category of journalists at the ethical codes of conduct of journalism come into play, but not a single specific targeted regulation or a definition of fact-checking. We've also asked them what did they perceive, like what is a fact-checker in their view, and what are not fact-checkers, if there were organizations that were portraying themselves as fact-checkers, but they were not fact-checkers. So it was also interesting to see that there was no solid consensus on this. But yeah, I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of fact-checking is how much it's regulated, even though it's not directly regulated.
Yes, I'm trying to think how to articulate a question, but because I don't understand the role of automated fact-checking enough, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I'd like to understand it much better, and I wonder if you could perhaps simply explain it much better, because of course fact-checking is about trying to give us a whole series of facts upon which we can then have public debate, and the debate about your truth and my truth and Trump's truth and everybody else's truth is. But fact-checking should be a countermeasure to that debate, and so the idea of automated fact-checking should be, that sounds fantastic on one level. On the other level, it also sounds like the next dystopian step. And who's in charge of the fact-checking? I think you pointed that out just a couple of minutes ago about what are the ideologies, what are the sort of values behind this fact-checking? Who's verifying that? This is just on social media content. Who's doing the fact-checking on large language models? This is a real concern, where different large language models are sort of drawing their information from. And I think people touched upon it. The dangers of putting news behind a paywall is that large language models stop using quality news for their work and they use other sources of content, Russian, Chinese, American content, etc. But yeah, if you could just sort of explain a bit more about this codification that fact check has been drawn into, perhaps unwillingly, I'm not sure, and what the risks are, and can the DSA perhaps sort of identify that as this is a risk that platforms need to find measures against? As I say, I don't understand enough to give a clear enough question.
Can I just because I'm also just conscious of lunch, and so I'm worried about that as well. But I think there's a really great, I don't know if Juliana, unless you want to come in with anything, but I was going to say there's a strong, if you go to fullfact.ai, so this is it's a UK fact-checking organization, and they're the ones that are really leading in a way in terms of thinking also about the expansion of this tool. And you can also request a demo, and it describes the ways in which they use it to like preemptively like monitor text and video, alert people when misinformation is repeated so that you can act quickly. They transcribe it. So I think they're primarily trying to work on exporting this tool to countries that have less capacity than, say, full fact AI. But I think one of the questions, at least that we've been really looking at, not just full fact AI, because there's many of these different tools. Now this is becoming like quite a competitive space, I would say, similar to the efforts of, Zuckerberg said, oh, we're not going to need human content moderators anytime, in the future, because we're going to be able to automate all of it. So there's many other different models. I think one of the questions that we've had with this, thinking about our work on legal consciousness, is what are the data sets that these models are being built on? And so what are the, we were looking at one, I can't remember what is the name, that had like 20,000 different fact checks that they were attempting to train their model on. And we're saying, okay, where are these fact checks from? Are they from, South Africa? Are they from the UK? What are the rules that these fact checkers have been looking at when they have done these fact checks that are then being used? So.
No, I think that's pretty much it. Another example that we have, just to make things a bit more tangible perhaps, was an example that I think it was Maldita in the conference. Yeah, so they developed this no, it wasn't Maldita. I forgot the fact-checking organization. Anyway, so sorry about that. Fact Chequeando, I think. It was from Latin America. And they developed this tool just for people, immigrants in the US, to go and fact-check issues concerning immigration status and immigration news, because, of course, with the Trump administration, things got very messy over there, and more news about changes to the legal status of people and change it to the immigration rules. So they developed this chat box that people just can go and ask, is this true or not, giving more information. And everything was curated by this fact-checking organization in itself. So it was not retrieved from web services, but then they themselves were saying it was getting trickier and trickier, because with the changes of the rules every day, basically they were trying to do more fact checks just to feed in the system. But I think this is a very tangible example of how they do it, basically. And just to go back quickly to the questions of truth, I think this is one of the issues that we're trying to address in this paper, is they're reconfiguring what do we see as true when they insert these new models, these algorithms. So there is a bit of literature on algorithmic truth. So instead of just saying what is true or not, we just look into what the algorithms themselves portray as truth. And what they do is basically they give you a percentage, or they give you an estimation of what can be true, but it's not necessarily truth. So we engage a bit with that, in the paper. But this is the last section of the paper, so we're still discussing a bit how to structure this.
Anyone else? Just for the automated stuff, that's it, to bless the European Union. There were two more projects, by the way. One was called Titan, that we just finished, actually, which is the use of AI by citizens. So if you Google Titan Horizon project. And there's another one which is called Vera AI, which is how journalists can use AI to kind of automate it. So there are some stuff that are fully automated, semi-automated, not so automated yet, you do it yourself. So but you can check Vera and Titan. These are the two other Horizon projects that were just finished. We have 1 hour for lunch, more or less. Lunch is already served. I'll see you in